He utterly hated Paul McCartney. Now we know the reason why. What if I told you that one man held a grudge against Paul McCartney for over 5 decades? Not just any man, but someone who was there at the very beginning, someone who helped shape the Beatles before the world even knew their name. This is the story of Pete Best, the Beatles' original drummer, and the painful betrayal that he could never forget. A story of jealousy, ambition, and the cruel twist of fate that left one man behind while his former bandmates conquered the world. Today, we're diving deep into why Pete Best utterly hated Paul McCartney and the shocking reasons behind that bitterness. Before the screaming fans, before Ed Sullivan, before Abbey Road, there was a coffee club in a Liverpool basement. And there was a young drummer named Pete Best. Born Randolph Peter Best on November 24, 1941, in Madras, British India, Pete's story begins in a world at war. His father served as a marine engineer during World War II, while his mother, Mona Best, was an ambitious and spirited woman who would change the course of rock and roll history. When the war ended, the Best family relocated to Liverpool, England. And this is where things get interesting. Mona opened the Casbah Coffee Club in the basement of their home on Hayman's Green. This wasn't just any venue. This small, smoky club became the launching pad for many young musicians, including a group of local teenagers who would soon change music history forever. Pete grew up surrounded by rhythm and the energy of post-war Liverpool, a city that pulsed with early rock and roll. While attending grammar school, he developed a natural affinity for percussion, experimenting with makeshift drum kits. His quiet, brooding demeanor contrasted sharply with the more flamboyant personalities around him, but his cool composure made him stand out. In 1959, local teenagers John Lennon, Paul McCartney, and George Harrison were forming a group called the Quarrymen. They often played at the Casbah Club. When they decided to become a full-time rock and roll band, eventually calling themselves the Beatles, they found themselves in desperate need of a permanent drummer. Pete Best was the natural choice. In August 1960, Pete officially joined the Beatles, and the lineup was set for what would become the band's legendary first stint in Hamburg, Germany. Hamburg! The word became legendary in Beatles lore. Weeks of all-night performances in grimy clubs that shaped their style, stamina, and musical chemistry. And Pete Best was right there in the thick of it. His powerful drumming helped drive the band's sound during these formative days. Fans and club owners in Hamburg were captivated by his looks and rhythmic intensity. With thick dark hair and a serious, brooding expression, Pete became something of a heartthrob among female fans. And here's where the first cracks began to show. Pete could feel it. Paul McCartney didn't like that some of the girls in the audience were looking at Pete instead of him. As Pete himself later said, "It sounds petty now, but when you're young, jealousy can eat away at friendships." But it wasn't just about the attention from fans. There were deeper musical differences brewing. McCartney was a perfectionist, obsessed with precision and harmony. Pete had a rougher, more natural style that fit the raw energy of their early performances. Paul wanted everything polished, Pete recalled years later. But the Beatles back then weren't about polish. We were about power. According to Pete, Paul would criticize his drumming quietly, behind his back, rather than being upfront about it. I found out later that he was one of the ones pushing George Martin to replace me. While Pete and John Lennon had developed a genuine friendship, Pete felt that Paul always kept a certain distance. "We were never mates the way John and I were," he admitted. Paul was friendly enough on the surface, but there was always something calculating beneath that polite smile, like he was sizing everyone up. Paul was ambitious, maybe the most ambitious of all of us, Pete said. He had this vision of the Beatles being perfect. And in his mind, I didn't fit that vision. By 1962, the Beatles were on the verge of something extraordinary. They had secured a recording contract with EMI, and producer George Martin was ready to work with them. Everything Pete had worked for, all those grueling nights in Hamburg, all those early gigs at the Casbah, was about to pay off. And then came August 16th, 1962. Pete was called into manager Brian Epstein's office. The meeting was brief and brutal. He was being replaced by another drummer, Ringo Starr. Just like that. No warning, no real explanation. The firing devastated Pete. He had been with the band through their toughest early years, helping them refine their stage act and earn their first major opportunities. Yet just as they were on the verge of worldwide fame, he was left behind. The official story was vague. George Martin supposedly didn't think Pete's drumming was strong enough for recording. But over time, stories surfaced suggesting that personal conflicts within the band had played just as big a role. Pete always believed Paul was at the center of that conflict. "It wasn't just losing the band," Pete said years later. "It was losing the brothers I thought I had. And Paul, out of all of them, felt like the one who really wanted me gone." That revelation, that McCartney had played a role in his dismissal, was something Pete never fully forgave. After being replaced, Pete fell into a deep depression. He struggled to find work and even considered giving up music entirely. Meanwhile, the Beatles rocketed to superstardom. "Watching them on television after that was torture," Pete admitted. "And when I saw Paul smiling and joking, it felt like a knife in the gut. He had everything I'd lost: fame, fortune, and the band I'd helped build." Time passed. The Beatles became the biggest band in the world. Pete Best became a footnote in their history. The man who almost made it. But unlike some who might have been consumed by bitterness, Pete handled his fate with remarkable grace, at least publicly. He formed other bands, including the Pete Best Band, and later stepped away from music entirely, working for the civil service for many years. He married Kathy, whom he'd met at a Beatles party at the legendary Cavern Club in 1962, and together they raised 2 daughters and maintained a relatively private life in Liverpool. Yet the bitterness toward Paul never truly faded. In interviews over the years, Pete was often asked about his relationship with the other Beatles. His tone would noticeably change when Paul's name came up. "Out of all of them," Pete once said, "Paul was the one I had the hardest time forgiving." That statement carried decades of resentment. Resentment born from what Best saw as McCartney's quiet ambition and calculating nature hidden beneath his polite smile. Even when he praised John Lennon's creativity or George Harrison's kindness, he drew a firm line with Paul. John was wild. George was thoughtful, he once said. But Paul was the one who always had to be in control. That's who he was then, and that's who he still is. It wasn't pure hatred, though, more a mix of pain and lingering mistrust. Pete admitted that he respected what McCartney achieved, but he could never separate that from what he lost. "I can't deny he's a genius," Pete said, "but geniuses can be ruthless, and Paul was ruthless with me." "Time heals a lot of things," he said in a later interview. "But not that. Paul and I were never friends. I doubt we ever could be." But Pete Best's story didn't end in bitterness. In 1995, something remarkable happened. The Beatles anthology was released, a monumental project that included a television documentary, a series of albums, and a detailed book revisiting the band's earliest days. Among the tracks were original recordings made before Ringo Starr joined, with Pete Best on drums. When these recordings were officially released as part of Beatles Anthology 1, Best was legally entitled to royalties. For the first time since his departure in 1962, he received significant financial compensation for his contributions to the band's formative years. This was deeply symbolic. Not only did it provide Best with overdue recognition, but it also represented a measure of closure and redemption. Fans around the world celebrated this turn of events, viewing it as justice for a musician who had endured decades of obscurity. Best himself later admitted that the royalties brought him both financial comfort and emotional satisfaction, reaffirming that his place in Beatles history was genuine and unerasable. In 2008, Pete stepped further into the spotlight with the release of his own album, Hayman's Green, which was met with surprising critical approval. The album's title paid homage to the Liverpool area, where the Casbah Coffee Club had once stood. Critics noted that the album reflected not only Pete's musical maturity, but also his reflective outlook on the long and winding path his life had taken. Songs like Come With Me and Dream Me Home displayed emotional depth and craftsmanship, proving that Pete Best was more than just the man before Ringo. In the end, Pete Best's story and his feelings toward Paul McCartney became one of rock history's great emotional scars. The heartbreak of the man who almost had it all, and the resentment toward the friend who, in his eyes, made sure he didn't. When people talk about the early days of the Beatles, there's often a nostalgic sense of camaraderie. 4 young men from Liverpool chasing a dream. But behind that shining legend was a storm of personal tension, bruised egos, and painful betrayal. For Pete Best, the deepest wound of all came not from fame slipping through his fingers, but from the man he felt most wronged by, Paul McCartney. Some wounds never fully heal. Some grudges last a lifetime. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into rock history, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Let me know in the comments. Do you think Pete Best was justified in his feelings toward Paul McCartney? See you in the next video.